You're listening to Innovators, the podcast from Harris Search Associates, where we speak with global leaders in education, research, engineering, and the health sciences, and ask them to share lessons learned as they continue to advance the frontiers of innovation and discovery. Today's podcast will be led by Rick Skinner, Senior Consultant.
If additional evidence were needed to substantiate the centrality of information technology in higher education, the impact of COVID-19 provides evidence of plenty. Summer classes and now the fall term confirms again the importance of IT, even as arguments of whether online education is, quote, as good as, unquote, traditional in-person seminars, classrooms, and lecture halls. Ironically, the question of international students attending American universities via online classes raised a legal issue of whether those students would be permitted into the U.S. in order to take courses online. And one wonders if American students going abroad for a semester, if that were still possible given the restrictions on international travel, whether those students can enroll in their home institutions' online offerings while in Spain or Australia or Guatemala or any other country and still talk of an international experience. The technology that promised to bring the world together is, for now at least, being subject to the same sort of scrutiny and doubt it faced a quarter century ago. In the midst of all of this, we have the benefit of an innovator's guest who serves the unique role as the Chief Information Officer and as Vice President for International Operations at Rice University, one of America's highly ranked institutions. She, we feel certain, has faced the issues that attend wearing two hats, if you will, and she can share with us what her work in the two realms has provided in terms of answering some of these questions. Klara Jelinkova was Rice University's first Chief Information Officer when appointed in 2015, leaving her previous post as Associate Vice President and CIO at the University of Chicago. She started her career in academia at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she also earned her undergraduate degree. Prior to that, she worked in IT for a publishing firm and as a research officer for the American Council of Education in Prague. She earned a Master of Education from Boston University. Her leadership at Rice was recognized twice for innovation awards by the magazine CIO, and she received the Internet 2 Leadership Award in 2019. Ms. Jelinkova credits her mother as her inspiration for the career she chose, relating how her mother smuggled a Commodore 64 into the Czech Republic that made it possible for her daughter to learn basic programming. I'm hoping there's a statute of limitations in the Czech Republic on smuggling, and Ms. Jelinkova's mom is safe from prosecution for that Commodore 64. Welcome to Innovators.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Yours is an unusual position, one that bridges really two realms of a university, information technology and international operations. And I imagine your facility in language would be an asset for you. I speak from experience, painful experience in some cases, that just how complex it can be to take a university and have it engage in international operations with any degree of endurance. That's a very formidable task in itself. But at the same time, it's not unlike the compliance and risk factors you face when you do something with technology. How did these two areas, again, how did they come together in your portfolio of duties? Is it something distinctively Rice? I know there was a group that did a great deal of study and thought about before they recruited you. Is it something distinctive about Rice and the way they plan to approach the use of technology? Is it something that the university felt that they had not invested time or enough energy in? What was it that brought someone like you to Rice with the unusual set of titles that you have? Or maybe it's just your talents that they capitalized on. What was it?
The areas really came together as part of the university's vision for the second century. So this was a strategic planning exercise. And one of the goals is extending RISE's reach and impact through international engagements. Mm-hmm. And so it is important to note that RISE does not really have centers or campuses abroad. We have one center in Paris that is tied to our School of Architecture. Mm-hmm. And so when we were looking at this question 3 years ago, we really asked, is the model of building physical centers abroad still the model, or is something more flexible emerging? And so in that way, technology allows you to be a global institution without having the expense of building these centers, right? And so my role is to work with the university leadership to ensure that international programs and relationships have the seamless connection through technology back to campus and can work with each other. So, for example, we don't have campus in China or center in China, but as you know, in the last year, we have faced significant challenges with our students in China. And so we worked with a company called WeWork that you may have heard of it. It has flexible spaces across the world, and also with a Chinese university to partner on providing physical location, but we did not go through the process of acquiring space or building out a space. So it was really about thinking about that flexibility that you probably want to have with your international engagements, especially as the geopolitical situation is becoming more and more complex. And you really need to think about a little bit more along the lines of private industry that thinks about investing and divesting in a more flexible way.
That's fascinating. Could I just quickly ask on that? The notion of staying away from buying or building buildings, that was more a case of saying that's not the way we intend to engage in that particular country. Is that what it was about?
No, it was really about the commitment and the speed of delivery, right? So it really is the velocity with which you have to start reacting. So it was speed and flexibility. So we are extremely committed to China. To let you know, we are 25% international in our student body, especially in the graduate student body. But a lot of our students come from China and then, India. So we are very committed to those regions. But it is thinking about where you want to be in those regions and how you want to think about that engagement. That it really is flexibility and the speed with which you can deploy a new solution.
It's interesting. I was president of a Canadian university that undertook to provide learning around the Pacific Rim, including China and the like. And one of the things we found was something very similar to that. We did not want to be involved in real estate. That was not what we were about. And the model we had was a blended learning model that we built a learning platform based on the idea of cohorts, and the students themselves, all of whom were typically in their 40s, somewhere in a midway up an organization. And we brought them together sometimes for 2 to 3 weeks, wherever we wanted to, and then sometimes in the home country. So it was the same kind of model in the sense that we did not want to have a campus or a site. We wanted to work with a partner institution, Thailand and China and the like. But it's the same thing. What's interesting to me is you saw the need to be able to have flexible, as you put it, high velocity ability to move. Tell me the velocity part. Is that because of the uncertainty of the environment?
Yeah, and I would just say that is increasingly the issue, right? Remember, we were in a pretty stable world prior to the most recent set of crises that we are dealing with, which is not just COVID-19, but we have, breakdown of international relationships between countries. We are, facing economic issues, et cetera. Kind of sets of questions around race and equity in the United States. I mean, we are focused on the COVID-19 crisis, but it is not just a COVID-19 crisis, right?
There's more
And I
to
think
the world than that.
so sometimes you have to react very, very nimbly. For us, we did not expect the situation that our incoming students would not be able to arrive in the spring. In February of 2020, we didn't know that by August of 2020, we were facing a situation where a student could not get a visa in China. But I think you're also right in what you said earlier, which is the immersions that students want do not have to be semester long. I think one of the things that we are seeing more and more is we are so tied to the academic calendar, but the students are not. They want short immersions. They want, research projects, and they can be only a few weeks long, give them kind of an immersive experience, but they may not want to commit for a full semester.
So you really have created a model of international education, which technology plays a significant role, but nevertheless, the model was intended to afford, one, the students an opportunity for international immersion, but at the same time enable you to have some flexibility in how you chose to carry that out.
Absolutely. And, I would just say this is still evolving, right? It's, right, and it is going to continue to evolve. I think this trend in just put it at a high level of student mobility, students wanting to learn from anywhere and expecting the institution to be more personalized and tailored is something that was already a trend, but it's a trend that has been accelerated through COVID-19. And I think it's going to be very difficult to take that away from the students and, quite frankly, from the faculty and staff as well, right? Because I think what has happened is we have had these technologies in existence for a long time, that'd be, Zoom conferencing or, whichever, right? But they were not used. We didn't have the adoption, right? And that was really the problem. But what COVID-19 has assured is adoption, rapid adoption. We went up the adoption curve, in a very short period of time. Yes, people were forced to do that. But as they are gaining confidence with the technologies, they're now starting to innovate, because that's one of the key things that I think CIOs need to do. They need to enable innovation by others, right? So you cannot just put the technology out there, train people on it, and, we are good, right? But it is more about empowering people to innovate and put different pieces together and not be afraid that sometimes people are going to use things in a slightly different way than you envision, right? Because that's ultimately what you want. And you do want the academic innovation to continue to reside with the faculty, right? And in order for that to happen, the faculty need to have confidence in their use of the technology, right?
Just one comment on that. The university I worked at in Canada, they had sought to use some standard technology when they decided to go through this cohort model. And in the end, they had to write their own, because, as you say, what the faculty wanted drove everything. That drove everything. And so simply buying something off the shelf that was sort of one model fits everyone, they couldn't do that. And so they had to build it. What I think I hear you saying also is that there is some good fortune in this, in that this whole move toward working from wherever has kind of converged with the model you're talking about, so that people can literally learn, research from anywhere. So the good news is that the technology is enabling, and it's not getting in the way anymore, which it did, candidly, for a long time. It just got in the way. It's a great model. Let me talk about your career for a moment, because as I said earlier in a conversation, you've had a remarkable career, and it spans the first 2 years of the 21st century. And I think if, the reality is, if the early part of the 20th century was about physics and so forth, this will be mostly about technology and biology, to use just the common words. You were not always working at an executive level, but I suspect you were very much aware of the nature of technology circa 2000. I can remember that fairly well. and all the issues you and your colleagues at Rice are dealing with now. So as you look back to the early days of the century, circa 2000, which issues were uppermost on your mind as a CIO or CTO then? Do they still pose the biggest challenge to you? And are there issues that have emerged of late that you think you're going to have to deal with for some time?
And Rick, I would just say, when I was at UW-Madison, which is when that happened, I was incredibly fortunate because the person who was CIO then, Annie Stunden, was my mentor.
Oh.
And it was an incredible experience to have very early in your career to have someone just say, "Come with me to a meeting." And I didn't really participate in the meeting, but I got to observe it. And she would, we would then talk about what happened. I only bring this up not just because I had a view, but because I think we sometimes forget about the importance of mentorship in technology and in higher education. And I owe who I am to someone early on in my career seeing that I had talent and potential and saying, come with me and, let's talk, right? And showing me a view into a world that I would not have seen, right? And so I'm always very thankful to Annie and, for choosing me, and to Tracy Fusey also at Duke for seeing a potential in me. But I have had the fortune of working for two remarkable women early in my career. So I just want to kind of put that out there because I think it's important to the question that you're asking.
If I may, I just intervene to say the fact that there were women in those positions at that time was itself somewhat unusual. Right. So you were really quite fortunate in that respect. What was on the plate there? What were the burning issues then? Do they still persist? Are there new ones?
Yeah, so I'm sorry. Now I'm going to go back to answering your question. If you remember year 2000, it was all about Y2K. How quickly we forget, right?
It's a nightmare for me.
But I think it's fair sometimes to ask the question, was Y2K, the crisis of Y2K, a time when CIOs lost some credibility? And hear me out, but it was a situation where there were very substantial investments in technology. Kind of nothing happened, but the ROI was not there either. And so there was a big investment, to fix a bug. I'm not belittling that, but I don't think that at the level of the presidents and chancellors of universities, they really saw what this got them. I think that was an example. If you compare it to the COVID-19 crisis, the Y2K crisis was an example where technology, people did not see the potential and did not understand what was the return on investment. Well, now in COVID-19, I think most presidents, if not all, completely see that. And I think that something can be learned from the Y2K crisis, which is that CIOs, especially when we are asking for major investment, need to increasingly pay attention to what is the institution getting out of it and how is the institution going to be different, and really articulating return on investment more. And I think we did not need to do that as much early on, 20, 25 years ago, right? So I think that's an important distinction.
But that's a big change that I was on the state I worked in, I was on the governor's task force on this. And I always I remember as we got closer and closer to the date, somebody once said to me, "What if nothing happens?" And I said, "Oh, no, we're ready and we'll deal with it." And of course, nothing happened. And so it's sort of like being in the situation of public health, saying, if you don't do this, you don't do that, you'll have these diseases. Well, they do it, whatever they ask to do. And of course, we don't have diseases. And people say, why do we make that investment for? Nothing happened. Same with Y2K. But you're right. Most presidents are not going to be snookered about the kinds of investments that are being made. What's the return on this? So you would have to make a case for any major enterprise sort of technology investment. But are there other issues? And let me specifically point to one. This notion of a student belonging to a university. That student deals with one university. We're beginning to see something early on now where students are taking classes from multiple institutions. And that seems to me, because we've always had this sort of moat and bridge to the castle, we've always thought we were isolated. Now you can't do that. Students are in a variety of situations.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I would just say the other issues, that were not as prevalent then that are prevalent now are security. Security is a completely different ball game than it was then, right? Yep. And I would say the emergence of privacy as a very important construct, right? Because in the year 2000, the internet was still new. Not as many people were connected. Everybody was blogging. Do you remember that? Everybody was blogging. There were, forums and, but now people are much more, this concept of privacy and what do I reveal and how much control I have over my own information has come to a forefront. And the last piece, which we really talked about earlier, is this integration in flexible architectures, not tying yourself to a monolithic system, but rather having the capability of integrate multiple systems together, right? So I think those are the things that did not quite exist 20 years ago that have now come into the forefront. Now, this question of belonging that you asked is really, really important. So not only are students taking classes from multiple institutions, but you also have new entrants on the market that you didn't have before, the Coursera's, edX's, et cetera. And I think this question of how a student feels the sense of belonging is very important for institutions to answer. There is a research in this area of student voice and student engagement, right? And what you realize is that the sense of belonging is not tied into what happens in the classroom, but what happens outside of the classroom, right? The ability of students to have to participate in the student life elements. At Rice, we had our students, I think it's now 7 years ago, run a survey which asked how much of your Rice experience are, different components, classroom, leadership opportunities, student clubs, we have residential, so living in colleges. And believe it or not, the classroom portion was roughly 20%. And so some of us that are older, right, think of the classroom experience as 80% of the student experience, but that's not the case anymore. And I think it is in the remaining 80% where we are creating the sense of belonging. But I think that's where the technology is not quite there yet.
Especially if you consider that the traditional college student between the ages of 18 and 22 living on campus and not working extensively out in a job makes up about 11% of the student population now. Statistically, if you looked at what the typical American student is, it's a 36-year-old woman with a full-time job. And that's a different set of experiences they're looking for to tie them, or maybe that's not the right, for them to give their loyalty, if you will, to an institution. And it's much more, I think, associated with the idea of service. You have to serve me well now. And the old days when I was a young man, which is back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, where students had to go through perfect hell to register for classes, you can't do that anymore. You can't do things like that. So your point's well taken. The expectations of students in terms of what they look for in an institution, yes, it does have something to do with the learning and the degree and the certificate and the credentials things, but it may have a lot more to do with relationships, not just between themselves and faculty, but relationships among students in classes. So it does seem to me that raises two issues, the security and the privacy issue, all at the same time.
Yeah, and I would just say, to this point, it's also career services. So, remember, it used to be that you went to college to find yourself, right? And you kind of assumed you were going to get a job out of it, right? But now it is really people are going into college to get a job. So there are certain areas of the university, such as career services, that are increasingly more important.
Especially now. I'm going to change subjects on you. I want to go back to another time and place. Sometimes when you do implement a large-scale technology, it has a lot of effects on an organization. I can remember back, I'm old enough to remember when we had remote job stations that you key punched and did all that. So I feel like I'm talking to Gutenberg at times. Live Gutenberg at that. But sometimes when you implement those, the organization, without anybody planning it, changes. We went away from mainframe computers. It began making powerful organizational changes. I guess I'm kind of curious. In your case, you've worked at 4 major research universities. And in those cases, I suspect in every one of them, you've had to undertake big changes in technology. What are the side effects of when you implement big scale technologies, even if the scale is really how does the individual user experience this? What effects does it have? And is it your role as a CIO to sort of expect some of the unexpected and anticipate those? Or is it one of those things that's more organic? It just has to happen and you figure it out. I say that because when you stop and go back and look at universities 35 years ago, they were very different organizations. Decisions were made in a somewhat different way. Now, how much of that is technology? I'm not going to argue about because I don't really know. But from the CIO, CTO's point of view, are you in some way obliged to really think through what the effects of implementing big technology is going to be on an organization?
I think absolutely yes. But I think the responsibility is not in you knowing. The responsibility is in you engaging with people to answer that question, right? To ask and answer that question together, right? Because to me, it's a little bit similar to informed consent. Ultimately, it is the institution that is making the decision. But it is absolutely the role of the CIO to say, with this decision, these are the types of areas or types of things that you need to think about. If there's further discussion that is needed, to make sure that the right people are aware of those issues. And so I think the role of the CIO is much more of a convener and mediator than it is about, someone who has necessarily all the answers. Because I think if you pretend that you have all the answers, then you become kind of a technology pusher, versus somebody who is a trusted partner that is consulting on, you have your area of expertise, your area of knowledge. You need to be able to articulate it in non-technical terms. You need to be able to articulate it in either academic or business terms. But you really are the place where that conversation happens. And so I think one of the things that is very useful to think about is what I would call communities of practice or centers of excellence. So when you are pushing out technology, one of the important things is to give people a place in which they can talk about the experience. So whether it's a center of excellence around data analytics, so we embarked on this big initiative around data analytics, and one of the things we did was we pulled a group together, which is number of people across campus, and all they do is talk about how they use the tools. And when you do that, they hear from each other, and it's oftentimes more powerful than when they hear just from the technical people. When we were switching to online in March in COVID-19, I pulled people from administrative units together. And each, we had a set of tools that, everybody was using, and we asked, well, how are you moving your operation to fully online? There was admissions, registrar's office, development, and they each were saying, this is how I have taken the components and how I am putting it together myself. And you would see light bulbs going off in people's heads because they say, oh, I could do that. And so I think developing these communities of practice and allowing people to share the experience and kind of this act of co-creation with the technology people is really important. And I think that's how you get this serendipity, and you increase the likelihood of the kind of serendipitous interaction.
That's really interesting. The idea of the CIO CTO as the convener and someone who's probably eager for conversation for precisely the reasons you said. All of a sudden, aha, I see what somebody else is doing. Give you a specific example. In 1994, a new chancellor came into the university system I was at, and he visited all 30-something campuses. And what he heard, interestingly enough, was that from the librarians, they have long been the champions of cooperation and collaboration, whether it's books or whatever. And so he said, well, what if I could find you $25, $30 million? What would you do? And they said, we'd link all our libraries and create an electronic library. And so he thought, well, when he went to somebody else, they would all have 5 different ideas, but the librarians all had this idea of creating a library that was literally without boundaries. What was even more so, they already had done a lot of the grunt work to get it ready. So I remember when I was asked to chair the committee that sort of oversaw the thing, the chancellor asked me at the time, how long will this take before we can start this? I said 150 days. And I remember he looked at me as if, Rick, you're crazy. But I knew that the librarians all had already done most of the groundwork. And it was an aha moment. So for example, when you saw that, you all of a sudden saw that all these people who had developed some really cool applications in chemistry, for example, wanted to be able to collaborate with their fellow chemists all over the system. So your point as the convener is a striking use of the term, because it really is someone who's open to accepting or at least vetting a whole series of ideas. And that's a remarkable sort of model compared to the old model, which was the CIO walked in and told you, here are the manuals, better learn it because you're going to have to do it this way.
Yeah, and I think that model is over, to be honest with you, because I think that's how CIOs sort of became irrelevant.
I agree with you completely. I think that role, as it was played out, whatever gains it may have made, I think they lost in terms of the relevance of the CIO, CTO. In those ways, I agree.
Yeah, and also when you're having this discussion, it allows you to really push into the units more, because in the conversation you explore more about how they operate. And it's only when you learn how they operate that you can bring new solutions to the table, right? So you really want to be much more embedded. You don't want this delineation of this is the system and this is the business process, because for one, they're linked, right? So it makes no sense. But it needs to be much more of a collaborative co-creation type of an agreement.
Those days we used to talk to software providers who would always sort of talk about, we need to understand the business processes. And I remember watching admissions people and so forth kind of stare, we don't have business processes. Well, what they really meant was, how do you do the work you do? But as long as they use that, what are your business processes? I can remember watching faces go blank because they didn't have a clue what that meant in the context of being career services or whatever. But it does raise one big question to me, and it was raised not by me, but it was raised by someone not that long ago. Jeanette Wing is a professor of computer science and director of the Data Science Institute at Columbia. And back in 2006, she wrote a brief article, only about 3 pages long, under the title Computational Thinking. And I want to quote from it, just 2 short quotes. First one is, computational thinking is a fundamental skill for everyone, not just for computer scientists. To reading, writing, and arithmetic, we should add computational thinking to every child's analytical ability. Just as the printing press facilitated the spread of the 3 R's, what is appropriately incestuous about this vision is that computing and computers facilitate the spread of computational thinking. And then the second quote, computational thinking involves solving problems, designing systems, and understanding human behavior by drawing on the concepts fundamental to computer science. Computational thinking includes a range of mental tools that reflect the breadth of the field of computer science. Is that too bold a vision? Is that presumptuous? Is that audacious? Or is that simply reflecting what is?
I think it is reflecting what is, and I, it's important to realize that we are in information age. So discerning, manipulating, analyzing information to gain insights is a key lasting skill. So it's not about learning a programming language in Perl or even though I understand that COBOL programmers are now in high demand still, right? But
COBOL.
but when you go to the university, you're not looking to learn a skill. You're looking to really have a durable knowledge that you can apply over a span of career. And I think because we live in information age and because the ability to analyze information is going to be increasingly more important, tools that you learn in data science or computational thinking are going to be increasingly more important. And you see that, especially the ability to analyze information is an extremely important skill set. I think the ability to discern what is credible and what is not credible. We are just at the cusps of the start of it, and we already see situations where people cannot discern what is reality and what is not reality. With deepfake technology, the deepfake technology, we have seen that, right? It's going to be increasingly more important for people to be able to pull back and be able to analyze, right? So to me, the way that computational thinking was described is really about a deeply analytical skill set, right? And that's what I think is very important part of education. It's not the kind of rudimentary learning of how to do something. It is about the ability to synthesize and analyze information. And then in the computational age, and is really how do you use technology in order to glean those insights out of that information?
Just to follow up on that, is it the case now that the term that's used fairly often in everything from when you want to buy furniture to artwork and so forth, this notion of curators, that we need someone to play the role of curators? Now that's a very, I would say, 16th century notion that there is someone who possesses enough knowledge that they can make judgments of what's real and what. You're suggesting that while that won't go away, I think you're suggesting that the individual is going to have that skill because you're going to be inundated by information all the time. And your ability to turn to some other source and say, well, tell me which of these is correct, that would be the earmark of someone who is not adjusted to living in an age of technology, as opposed to someone who says, well, I know enough to go ask the expert. Am I wrong about the curated model? Is the curated model based on something that may not be the case anymore? That is, that there is somebody out there with sufficient knowledge to tell me what's right and wrong or true or false.
I think it's more about all of us becoming the curators and learning that skill. The war now, remember, we are in a stage where the war is for your brain. It's for your eyeballs on the computer. It's for what you think. And making students resilient adults in this age where they are inundated by information that is spun in such a way to evoke emotion and not thought is going to be very important. And it's something that universities can do that prepares people for the future in which they will be inundated. And to have kind of a level of resiliency in this very intrusive world, right, where the world sneaks into your household. I mean, all of these ads are getting into your household. All of the web scraping of where you have been last and what you bought, all of these things are happening now. And one thing, one idea is we just kind of give up and let computers run our world, right? But the other one is we retain control and become more discerning, curate our own experiences. I think that's the alternative. And I believe that universities are in a great position to create people who will be able to live in this world much more effectively.
May I encourage you to undertake some more work? That phrase, making students resilient for life in an age of learning, of information, That's about as powerful a phrase as I could see for an educated person. That notion of being resilient. It's not going to be easy, and you're not going to always be able to come down to a zero-sum choice of yes or no. It's going to be something that you're going to have to practice literally all your life because you're inundated from everywhere. I really want to encourage you to use that because I think that's a powerful idea that allows universities to play, if not a central role, an extraordinarily important role in terms of what we need to be doing with students. We started this interview to talk about technology. We ended up talking about education, and that speaks to me about the kind of world you've helped create. I want to thank you very, very much for taking time to be with us on Innovators. When next we talk, I want to see that article in Educom about resilient students in the age of information. Jelinkova, thank you very much for your time today, and thank you for being with us on Innovators.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Innovators, a production of Harris Search Associates. We'll have more insightful conversations with global thought leaders to follow.